The most important thing is your well-being and your health and your recovery. And on behalf of all of us here,
What secret pain has Simon Cowell carried beyond the glitter of fame? Behind the sharp judgments and worldwide success lies a father's most heartbreaking goodbye, born from his son's devastating diagnosis. For the first time, Cowell's private battles, silent sacrifices, and the choices that reshaped his entire legacy are revealed. Stay with us as we take you inside the untold story of Simon Cowell's most emotional phase. The moment fame met fatherhood. For years, Simon Cowell's identity was inseparable from the sharp edges of television. He was the face of brutal honesty on talent shows, the man audiences both feared and admired for his uncompromising standards. Success was measured in numbers, chart positions, and viewing figures. Yet away from the stage and the lights, his private world remained a mystery, rarely glimpsed and often misunderstood. What no one could predict was how fatherhood would pull him into a reality far richer than anything he had previously known. The shift began quietly, almost imperceptibly, long before the public caught on. The first hint came during those early medical scans, when Simon, once entirely immersed in contracts and deadlines, began carving out space in his calendar for hospital appointments. Colleagues noticed his phone calls growing shorter, his meetings ending earlier, but they assumed it was fatigue or burnout. In truth, he was beginning to feel a sense of responsibility that could not be delegated, one that no assistant or business partner could shoulder for him. When Eric Philip Cowell was born, Simon entered a role that no critic could prepare him for. The crying of a newborn was not background noise, but a revelation, a sound that rewired him. The moments holding his son for the first time carried a gravity unlike the flashing bulbs of paparazzi or the roar of an audience. This was not about performance or perception, it was about connection. Even his closest friends said they had never seen him soften in this way. What stood out was not just the joy of being a father, but the way it clashed with his lifelong pursuit of perfection. Simon had built his empire on spotting flaws, on demanding the best, yet here was a child who needed none of that. Eric's value was not conditional on talent, achievement, or image. He was loved simply because he existed. For a man whose world had been defined by high standards, this unconditional acceptance was quietly transformative. Privately, Simon began speaking about legacy differently. He had once thought of his shows and record labels as the markers he would leave behind. Now he started to wonder whether the greater legacy might be measured in bedtime stories, school runs, and the simple promise of being present. In interviews, he admitted to finding television less important than before, though few realized just how much his priorities had shifted. What also became apparent was how fatherhood reshaped his relationship with time. The fast pace of the entertainment industry no longer seemed sustainable when compared to the slow, meaningful moments of family life. The first smile, the first steps, the babbled words, all arrived like milestones more profound than any award ceremony. In his circle, people noticed Simon saying no more often, declining projects that once would have been irresistible. For someone accustomed to chasing the next success, learning to pause was a kind of revolution. Yet it was not all serenity. Becoming a father also sparked fear, the recognition of vulnerability that came with love. Simon began to think more about his own health, about whether his choices would give him enough years to watch his son grow. He took fewer risks, adjusted his lifestyle, and acknowledged the fragility of the life he had so carefully built. Fame had never made him nervous, but fatherhood introduced a different kind of pressure, one rooted not in ambition but in devotion. This transformation did not make him any less ambitious, but it certainly made him more human. To those around him, Simon Cowell was no longer just the kingmaker of pop culture. He was a man redefined by the small hands that gripped his finger and the gaze that looked to him for safety. It was the beginning of a chapter he never planned to write, one that forced him to see himself in ways beyond the brand he had built. But if fatherhood had introduced him to a new dimension of love, it would also soon confront him with questions he was unprepared to face. What happens when the child you cherish begins to show signs of struggling with a world you thought was secure? Stay with us to uncover the details. Whispers before words. It often begins in silence, in the tiny gaps where words should be but never arrive. For Simon Cowell and his family, those gaps became harder to ignore as little Eric grew. While other children of his age babbled through songs, repeated phrases, or eagerly mimicked sounds, Eric lingered in his own quiet world. He communicated, but differently, with glances that lasted longer than most, with an unusual sensitivity to what surrounded him. To a parent, these subtleties can feel like whispers in a storm, soft, almost hidden, yet impossible to miss. The signs were not dramatic, but they were persistent. Nights often turned restless, as though Eric carried a weight too heavy for sleep. Sounds that seemed ordinary to others, a blender in the kitchen, a passing siren, even the hum of an airplane overhead, would sometimes unsettle him. Family outings, which should have brought joy, occasionally ended in disarray when the bustle of new places overwhelmed him. His responses were not tantrums in the traditional sense, but rather a retreat, a need to withdraw from the chaos into something familiar and safe. Simon, who had spent decades analyzing performances down to the smallest detail, noticed these early differences with sharp attention. He was no stranger to spotting patterns, but this was different. This was his son, and the instinct to protect came before the instinct to understand. Together with Lauren Silverman, Eric's mother, he began watching carefully, piecing together a puzzle that seemed to stretch beyond their reach. Holidays with friends revealed contrasts more vividly. Surrounded by other children, Eric often preferred the corner, absorbed in his own focus rather than joining the games. While others might dismiss it as shyness, Simon sensed it was something more profound. It was not a lack of interest in others, but rather a different rhythm of interaction, one that didn't quite align with the world around him. These were quiet indicators, never loud, but unmistakable once you allowed yourself to see them. The most striking part of these early signs was the sensitivity to change. A slight alteration in routine could trigger unease. Moving from one environment to another without preparation left Eric unsettled. Where other children might adapt quickly, Eric needed stability, a map to guide him through what seemed unpredictable. This heightened awareness of routine was both a clue and a challenge, shaping the way Simon and Lauren began to organize their days around their son's comfort. As months passed, these observations weighed heavily. Parents often live in a space between hope and worry, convincing themselves that delays are temporary or simply part of individuality. Yet deep down, Simon knew the whispers were pointing toward a truth that demanded acknowledgement. The man who had built his career on decisiveness now found himself hesitating, caught between waiting for clarity and the urgent need to act. The turning point came not in a doctor's office, but in the family's living room. Watching Eric struggle to express something simple, something that should have flowed naturally, Simon felt a quiet ache that no success or wealth could soothe. It was the moment when whispers became undeniable, when the puzzle pieces demanded to be placed together. Still, there was no panic. Instead, there was resolve. Simon began researching, consulting professionals discreetly, and leaning on trusted voices who had faced similar experiences. He sought answers not through tabloids or public discussion, but privately within the safe walls of family. For a man who had always thrived on control, it was humbling to realize that the only control he could truly hold was in how gently he responded to his son's needs. These whispers, subtle and persistent, were the early foundation of a larger story, one that would soon crystallize with a diagnosis. Yet in those fragile years before the word was spoken, the Cowell family lived in a delicate space between uncertainty and love, listening to the cues their child gave them and learning to adjust to his unique rhythm. But what unfolds when questions harden into truths, when the shadows reveal their name at last? Come with us to find out more. December answers. There are moments in life when a single conversation changes everything, when the long stretch of uncertainty suddenly narrows into clarity. For Simon Cowell and Lauren Silverman, that turning point arrived in December of 2018. After months of observing, questioning, and wondering, they finally sat across from specialists who could provide an explanation for their son's struggles. The word given to them was both daunting and strangely relieving: autism spectrum disorder. Hearing the diagnosis for the first time carried a weight Simon was not prepared for. He had spent years mastering control over judges' panels, negotiations, and even unpredictable contestants, but nothing could prepare him for the vulnerability of sitting as a father and listening to experts describe his child's reality. It was not a moment of collapse, but of reckoning. The doubts and suspicions they had carried for so long now had a name: and with that name came both fear and direction. What surprised Simon most was how layered the explanation became. Autism, as the specialists emphasized, was not a singular path but a wide-ranging spectrum. Every child carried their own profile of challenges and strengths. In Eric's case, his hypersensitivity to sound and his need for structured routines were not isolated quirks. They were markers of how his brain processed the world differently. Alongside those challenges, however, came remarkable strengths, such as his sharp focus on patterns and his ability to engage deeply with subjects that captured his attention. December became a dividing line in Simon's life. On one side stood the uncertainty, filled with late-night questions and unspoken worries. On the other side lay clarity, a roadmap that allowed him and Lauren to begin shaping a future tailored for their son's unique needs. This shift did not erase the difficulty, but it allowed love to become more practical. Suddenly, therapy schedules could be drawn up, interventions could be introduced, and routines could be structured in ways that supported growth rather than hindered it. For Simon, who had built an empire on recognizing raw potential in others, the diagnosis reframed the way he looked at his own son. He no longer saw the silences or sensitivities as deficiencies, but as part of a different way of engaging with the world. That perspective was crucial in softening the blow of the diagnosis. Instead of grieving what might have been, Simon began to look forward to understanding what could be. Lauren, equally, became a steadying force during those days. Where Simon carried the burden of public scrutiny and the instinct to shield, she leaned into patience, ensuring that Eric's journey was not one defined by limitation, but by encouragement. The diagnosis became less of a label and more of a tool, a key that unlocked how to support their son best. Together, they made the conscious choice to view it not as the end of something, but the beginning of an entirely new chapter of family life. What also made the moment distinct was Simon's deliberate decision to keep it private. For most parents, a diagnosis might lead to conversations with friends or family. For Simon, it meant protecting Eric from the unforgiving glare of the media. The Cowell household in December 2018 became a sanctuary, a place where they could process, plan, and regroup without interference. Behind closed doors, love and strategy intertwined in ways few outsiders could imagine. Perhaps most importantly, December gave Simon a deeper sense of responsibility. Where once he was content to let his career dictate his identity, he now found himself measuring time differently. Therapy appointments mattered more than studio meetings, small breakthroughs outweighed ratings charts, and the joy of seeing Eric progress even slightly eclipsed achievements that once defined his life. What would happen next when the family took these answers back home and began reshaping their entire world around them? Stay with us as we reveal everything. Building a safer world. Every home tells a story, but for Simon Cowell, his Malibu residence became more than a retreat from fame. It became a carefully constructed sanctuary for his son. After the diagnosis, the walls that once echoed with the rhythm of busy schedules and high-profile gatherings took on a new purpose. The house had to evolve, not for style or luxury, but for comfort, calm, and consistency. Simon and Lauren began with small, deliberate changes. Lighting was softened to reduce overstimulation, and certain noisy appliances were swapped for quieter alternatives. Even textures and furniture were considered because what felt ordinary to one child could be unbearable to another. The goal was simple: create an environment where Eric felt safe enough to explore without the world pressing in too harshly. This was not about extravagance, but about attunement, about reshaping the familiar into something gentler. Daily life also transformed. Routines were no longer built around Simon's professional calendar, but around Eric's needs. Consistency became a tool for peace. Meal times followed predictable patterns, and transitions between activities were carefully signposted so they would never arrive as a shock. In the outside world, unpredictability was inevitable. Within their home, stability was the gift they could offer. Therapies entered their schedule, not as interruptions, but as anchors. Speech therapy introduced new ways of unlocking communication, while occupational therapy focused on practical skills that would help Eric interact with the world on his own terms. What amazed Simon was how progress revealed itself in the smallest details. A word pronounced more clearly, a gesture that showed recognition, or a moment of calm where once there had been distress. Each became a quiet victory. In this new rhythm, Simon found himself learning patience in ways his career never demanded of him. Television deadlines were rigid. Contestants either delivered or failed, but Eric's growth unfolded in subtle, often unpredictable ways. Progress was not linear, yet it was deeply meaningful. It required Simon to slow down, to celebrate the tiny steps that outsiders might overlook. One of the most striking changes came in how the family used their outdoor spaces. The garden, once a backdrop for relaxation, was redesigned into a safe environment where Eric could feel free without risk. Sound barriers softened the hum of Malibu's busy world, while designated play areas offered controlled exploration. Nature became an ally, providing both calm and stimulation in carefully measured doses. For Simon, these choices reflected not indulgence, but intention, a commitment to building a world where his son could thrive. Friends who visited the Malibu home noticed the difference immediately. The sharp, modern feel of Simon's past properties gave way to warmth and subtle structure. It was not about showcasing wealth, but about creating a place that felt protective. Those who knew Simon best understood that every adjustment, no matter how small, carried weight. They weren't seeing a celebrity's mansion. They were stepping into a father's shield. This reimagined environment also reshaped Simon's own routines. Late-night industry calls were replaced with evenings spent reinforcing Eric's therapies. Weekends became less about parties and more about family rituals. The public image of the relentless talent judge stood in stark contrast to the man now devoting his energy to creating a cocoon of stability for his child. How would Simon confront the emotional weight of protecting Eric while balancing his own fears, doubts, and sleepless nights? Come along as we uncover the hidden story. Night watches and quiet vows. In the stillness of night, when the world outside Malibu fell silent, Simon Cowell often found himself awake, pacing the quiet halls of his home. These hours were not filled with music or television reruns, but with thoughts that refused to rest. Fatherhood had brought him immense joy, yet it had also opened the door to anxieties he had never confronted before. Success in the entertainment industry was unpredictable, but it was a game he knew how to play. Parenting a child with unique needs was a journey with no script, no guarantee of applause, and no finish line. Sleep often came in fragments. Some nights were interrupted by Eric's restlessness, other nights by Simon's own worries. Would his son be understood by the world? Would he find acceptance among peers? Would the protective walls they built at home be strong enough to shield him from cruelty outside? These questions circled endlessly, and Simon's response was rarely to collapse under their weight, but to quietly make vows to himself about the kind of father he would be. One of those vows was to shield Eric from the glare of publicity. For decades, Simon had lived under the microscope of the press. His sharp tongue and high-profile lifestyle made him irresistible to tabloids. Yet, as he watched his son sleep, he resolved that Eric's life would not be reduced to headlines or speculation. The boy deserved privacy, not as a luxury, but as a right. This quiet promise shaped the way Simon handled public appearances, interviews, and even the photographs he allowed to circulate. Another vow was to be present in ways his own past might not have prepared him for. Long before Eric was born, Simon's reputation was built on being everywhere: sets, boardrooms, parties, and premieres. Now he recognized that presence was not measured in appearances but in consistency. If Eric needed him at home, that mattered more than the next big show. This adjustment demanded sacrifices that the public rarely saw. Offers were declined, meetings delayed, and opportunities passed over. What the world interpreted as Simon slowing down was, in truth, Simon stepping up. These night watches also became moments of reflection about his own upbringing. While Simon had always spoken fondly of his parents, he knew that his career had pulled him into a life far different from the one they envisioned. The glitz, the controversies, the power, it was intoxicating, but it also came at a cost. Watching Eric reminded him that he had the chance to do things differently, to root his son's childhood in security rather than spectacle. In these quiet hours, Simon's relationship with Lauren deepened in new ways. They were not just partners in raising a child, but guardians navigating uncharted waters together. Conversations whispered in the dark carried the weight of unspoken fears, yet they always circled back to a shared determination to give Eric the tools he needed to face the world without being broken by it. Their unity in those late-night discussions was a kind of strength that fame could never replicate. The vow to protect, however, did not mean isolation. Simon recognized that Eric would eventually step into a broader world. Preparing him for that required balance, building resilience without forcing exposure too quickly. The challenge lay in pacing, in knowing when to shield and when to gently push forward. This balance became Simon's private mission, an ongoing promise that shaped his decisions more than any contract ever had. The night watches may have been solitary, but they were not empty. They became the forge in which Simon's commitment to fatherhood was tested and strengthened. Each hour of lost sleep added to the determination that his son would never face the world unprepared or unsupported. How would Simon respond when whispers became headlines and the fight to protect his son's dignity extended beyond the walls of his home? Stay with us to know. Clearing the air carefully. Rumors have a way of spreading faster than truth, and in Simon Cowell's world, speculation was often louder than fact. When whispers about his son's condition began to seep into tabloids, it struck at the very core of the vow he had made to protect Eric's privacy. For years, Simon had accepted gossip as the tax of fame, but when it came to his child, the rules were different. This was no longer about a celebrity scandal or an industry rivalry. It was about the dignity of a little boy who had no say in the matter. The first time Simon saw Eric's name printed alongside speculative headlines, he felt a mixture of fury and fear. The media had often painted him as ruthless, but this was a different battle. It was not his own image being dissected. It was his son's. That distinction changed everything. Anger alone would not fix it. If he lashed out, it would only fuel the story. If he stayed silent, lies would spread unchecked. What Simon needed was balance, a way to clear the air without creating more noise. His approach was measured. Instead of staging an explosive denial or inviting cameras into his home, Simon chose selective honesty. In carefully chosen interviews, he acknowledged his son's challenges in broad strokes, confirming the reality without opening the door too wide. The tone was not defensive, but protective. He corrected the record without turning Eric into a spectacle. For a man known for blunt sound bites, his restraint revealed a side of him few had seen. Part of Simon's decision came from watching other public figures stumble when handling family matters. He had seen how oversharing could turn children into perpetual targets for paparazzi. He had also seen how denial often made rumors grow wilder. His strategy became one of controlled openness. Just enough truth to stop the speculation, but not enough to invade Eric's privacy. This balancing act was not easy. Every word spoken publicly carried consequences. A phrase taken out of context could dominate headlines for weeks. Simon's solution was to redirect attention whenever possible. Instead of focusing solely on his son, he used his platform to highlight the importance of early support and resources for families facing similar challenges. By broadening the conversation, he transformed personal vulnerability into advocacy, shifting the story from gossip to awareness. The public reaction surprised him. Fans who had once admired him for his ruthless honesty on television now expressed admiration for his tenderness as a father. Messages poured in from parents who shared their own journeys, thanking him for giving voice to something often hidden in shame. What could have remained a tabloid-driven intrusion instead became an opportunity for connection, handled only because Simon chose caution over confrontation. Privately, Simon's team worked tirelessly to protect boundaries. Paparazzi photos were monitored, interviews were negotiated with stricter conditions, and family events were shielded with unprecedented care. To outsiders, this might have seemed excessive, but to Simon it was simply non-negotiable. His son's story was not for sale, and no headline would ever justify compromising his trust. This careful clearing of the air also influenced Simon's relationship with fame. He had spent decades cultivating attention, yet now he found himself rejecting it in ways that surprised even him. The spotlight that once felt essential now seemed like a threat when it strayed too close to his family. Fame had given him everything he once desired, but at this stage of life, the thing he valued most was the ability to close the door and protect the peace inside. By addressing the rumors cautiously, Simon redefined what strength looked like in his world. It was not in sharp comebacks or viral moments, but in calm control and the refusal to let tabloids dictate the narrative. For once, his silence spoke louder than his words, and his careful statements carried more power than any outburst could. How could he protect him from the world's harsher realities, the misunderstandings, the judgments, the cruelty that sometimes waits beyond childhood? Let us tell you. The emotional goodbye. Goodbyes do not always happen in crowded airports or glittering finales. Sometimes they unfold quietly in the recess of a father's heart when he realizes that the life he once imagined for his child will not be the life his child truly needs. For Simon Cowell, this farewell was not to his son, but to the unspoken dreams he had carried long before Eric ever entered the world. Like many fathers, Simon once pictured a familiar story. He imagined a child who might inherit his love for music, a son who might walk beside him through the corridors of television studios, laughing under the glow of cameras. In his mind, he could see the little hand reaching for his as they stood on stages where applause rang out like thunder. These visions were never confessed openly, but they lingered quietly, tucked away like photographs that never existed. As Eric grew, however, it became clear that his journey would not mirror his father's imagined one. The way he interacted with the world, the sensitivities that shaped him, and the rhythm of his development all spoke of a path that diverged from Simon's original vision. It was not lesser, only different. And in that difference, Simon discovered something unexpected: the strength to let go. The goodbye was not sharp or sorrowful. It was tender, almost reverent, an acknowledgement that unconditional love means discarding expectations. Eric did not need to be a reflection of his father's career or legacy. He needed space to be wholly himself, with his own gifts, his own voice, and his own brilliance. That realization transformed Simon in ways no success in the industry ever had. Redefining success became a natural step. Ratings, contracts, and music charts had once defined the boundaries of achievement. Now, success lived in the smile of a child who found calm after a restless night, in the pride of every small milestone achieved, and in the gratitude of seeing family bonds grow stronger than any headline. For a man long branded ruthless, Simon discovered that true strength often came through surrender, not to defeat, but to love that outweighed ambition. Professionally, this meant stepping back from opportunities he might once have pursued without hesitation. Personally, it meant reshaping his entire life around presence. Bedtime stories replaced late-night meetings. Quiet walks replaced red carpet appearances. Each choice was a farewell to the man he had been and an embrace of the father he was becoming. The emotional goodbye was not about abandoning the past, but about accepting a future built on patience, protection, and devotion. And in that acceptance, Simon did not lose himself. He found peace. Which part of Simon Cowell's emotional journey touched you the most? Was it the sacrifices he made for family, the quiet battles fought away from the cameras, or the strength he found in letting go of old dreams? Share your thoughts in the comments below.